Generally, the definition of homologation special in motor racing goes like this. It's a very limited run version of an existing car designed to meet the bare minimum of road legality and the bare minimum production requirements for a specific racing series. But this homologation special is one of their most popular models, and might be the most important homologation special of all time. The BMW M3. Rewind your clocks back to West Germany, 1984, in the Deutsche Touringwagen Meisterschaft, or DTM series, which has just shifted to FIA Group A touring cars for its new top-tier racing series. And Mercedes had a brilliant answer, the 190e 2.3 16 Cosworth. Only it wasn't for DTM, it was for the World Rally Championship. But then they saw the Audi Quattro and went, haha, no thanks, switched gears and entered the DTM. It was a 350 horsepower monster that dominated the early years of DTM. And since it was a homegrown German racing series, sort of like our NASCAR or Britain's BTCC, BMW had to do something about this. So, they started developing a new car. But there was a problem. DTM homologation requirements meant that 5,000 road cars had to be made. The marketing groups didn't think there was a market for this car. But BMW, thankfully, said they can go away now, and moved on with the project. It was based on the 3 Series-ish. It had about 3 panels were the same, and the engine from BMW's M1 sports car, minus 2 cylinders. So instead of being an inline 6, it was a inline 4, but it revved to 7,300 RPM and made 200 horsepower. Then, the brakes and the suspension were all completely rebuilt and customized for the E30 generation, as it was internally named. And those body panels that they threw out, barring 3, they were all completely resculpted to drop the drag coefficient by 0.05. Now all it needed was a name. It was a 3 Series tuned by BMW's M division. M3 Series, no that's too long, M3, hey that could work. And so the E30 M3 was born. It was a car so good that it was listed as one of the 5 greatest driver's cars of all time. Sure, it only had 200 horsepower, but it had an incredibly light curb weight, which means it was brilliant in the twisty sections. People loved how this car felt. Very similar to the Ferrari F40, it was a pure driver's car. Sure, it had some amenities, but they were few and far between, and you really were connected to the car as a driver. But more to the point, it showed Mercedes who's boss, and took the DTM crown in 1987 and 1989. And that was just the tip of a motorsport iceberg. It won the Australian, Italian, British, European, and World Touring Car Championships. It even had success on tarmac rallies thanks to the twisty roads and being a twisty, fun car, winning the 1987 Tour de Corsa outright. This might very well be one of the greatest BMWs ever made. And it got even better because Mercedes saw BMW smack them around a bit and said no, no, no. So they made the 190e 2.5 16 Cosworth Evolution 2. That is a breathful. So BMW quickly responded with their own breathful. The BMW E30 M3 Sports Evolution. in 1991, power was up to 235, and all unnecessary features were thrown out to drop the curb weight to just 2,500 pounds. And also, they added new, larger, and adjustable front and rear aero along with brake cooling ducts just to make it a little more hardcore. But believe it or not, as much as I love the E30 Sport Evolution, it would not be the M3 E30 of my choice. That honor would go to the M3 pickup truck. Yes, it was not a concept, it was not an April Fool's joke, it was not a production car. It was a fully functional work vehicle for BMW's manufacturing plant, because they needed a car that could deliver parts quickly around their massive facility. So they chopped the entire back end off of an M3 and put a truck bed there. You would think this is a joke, but it was so good at its job it wasn't retired until 2012. So there you go. The same cannot be said for the normal E30 though. That was retired in 1992 when the E36 took over. This was a radical departure, but honestly one that might have been for the best. You see, the E30 was a purebred, no-frills, road-legal race car. Remember, homologation here, homologation. But the E36 went a completely different route. Since the E30 sold 10 times better than anticipated, they said, why don't we make this more accessible to the average person? Because the average person doesn't want to have stiff suspension, no air conditioning, racing seats. They want a proper interior. They want a smoother ride. So that's what BMW gave the masses. It was a proper road car, not just a road legal race car. Granted, that added almost 1,000 pounds to the curb weight, but the four-cylinder was ditched in favor of a good old-fashioned inline-six making 316 horsepower, except in America, where we got a M52 inline-six because regulations and EPA requirements. Never get anything good here. Or do we? You see, while we got the slower version of the M3, we got the faster Evolution version, for some reason. You see, in a bizarre twist of fate, we got one of the rarest and fastest E36s ever made, the Lightweight. This was a more return to form of the E30 generation, as a full-on, stripped-out, road-legal homologation special. Only 125 were made. They had no sunroof, no radio, no leather seats, no air conditioning, no sound insulation, and no toolkit. But what it did have was bodywork and chassis work made out of aluminum and carbon fiber, dropping the weight by over 200 pounds, and fully adjustable front and rear aero. And while the engine was technically the exact same, it had racing decals that looked phenomenal on the ice white paint, adding about 50 horsepower. But the 2000s were quickly approaching, as was a new M3, the E46. As the new millennia came into its own, so did the styling of the M3. Of course, the engine was pretty much the same, another inline-six, but now it made 338 horsepower, thanks to some individual throttle bodies and electronic throttle control. That meant a 0 to 60 of 5 seconds flat and a limited top speed of 155 miles an hour. That's gonna be a very common thing for the rest of this video. Damn Germans. It could do 170 delimited. But the biggest problem was not the limiter. It was the fact that they missed out on one of the greatest German cars ever. Because in 2000, they made a gorgeous beast of an M3 estate car, and then never put it into production. This is amazing. It's probably my favorite estate car out there. And they never made it. God damn it. What are you doing, guys? You absolute buffoons. But they sort of redeemed themselves with the M3 GTR. You see, while the traditional M3 had fully embraced being a proper, comfy sports car for the everyday person, the GTR continued the lightweights and the Sport Evolution versions of homologation brutal monsters, this time for the American Le Mans series. But unlike all the other homologation specials, the inline engines were ditched in favor of a 4-liter, naturally aspirated V8 making 443 horsepower. That meant a top speed of 186 miles an hour, and to get into the corners as fast as possible, weight was cut down thanks to carbon fiber construction. Only 6 of these things were ever made, and 3 of them were sold to the public. Now, officially it met the letter of the homologation rules, but rival motorsport teams saw that only 3 production cars were made, and they complained, saying that they're not actually making homologation road cars here. And they agreed. And in 2002, the rules were changed to make 100 cars the mandatory rule. So they gave up on racing in America and moved to Europe, winning the Nürburgring 24-hour endurance race outright twice in 2004 and 2005. So, when life gives you lemons, make lemonade. That would not be the last V8 M3 though, no. The E9X came out in 2007 with a naturally aspirated 4-liter V8 making over 400 horsepower. The V8 was in a proper road car this time, and it was also the first BMW with a double clutch transmission, which, while yes, giving a 0.2 of a second faster 0 to 60 time, it also gave hardcore fanboys heart attacks because it was a V8 double clutch transmission M3. What are you, psychopaths? And they got their pitchforks and torches and said, shame! The critics didn't give a damn and said it was one of the greatest all-arounders in the world. It was a phenomenal car. I'm not so sure on the bubbly styling, but to drive, it is an absolute legend. And once again, they made a special edition road legal track version, only it wasn't for any particular racing series, they just made one. Which I'm perfectly fine with, I'm just saying, the M3 GTS is one of the very few cars that can actually pull off the incredibly vivid orange paint it came in, partially because it could back it up with adjustable camber, ride height, and aerodynamics. It was a proper, legitimate track car that the M3 had not seen for quite some time. Only 135 were made, and as I mentioned, they were all in that incredible orange paint. That wasn't the only one to come back, because the M3 pickup truck came back, believe it or not. You see, after 26 years, the original E30 M3 was retired and replaced with a new E9X variant. And just to sort of prod at people, they did some track testing with it at the Nürburgring for April Fool's Day. Probably my favorite practical joke ever pulled by a car company, because it had no intention of being put in production. Nobody wanted one except a very small percentage of people like me, and yet they still did it just to mess with people. So, bravo, BMW, bravo. The F80 M3 was in 2014. This was a little bit more back to basics with a 3-liter inline 6, but because of regulations, it had 2 turbochargers making 425 horsepower, which meant 0 to 60 in 4 seconds flat. And if for some reason that wasn't crazy enough for you, you could get the competition package, which was even more powerful and even more unnecessary, because the base car was still the benchmark in sports sedan handling. Yes, for some reason unknown to science, the coupe version was split off as the M4. Why? I don't know. All I do know is that the M3 was briefly discontinued in 2018 for emission regulations, which meant that the M4 was given the GTS treatment instead of the M3. Almost 500 horsepower, a full roll cage, super sticky road legal racing tires, carbon fiber, and water injection. That meant a Nürburgring lap time half a minute faster than the M3 CS. pretty impressive actually, not gonna lie. But splitting off the M3 Coupe into its own brand was nowhere near the most controversial BMW has ever taken the M3 because the G80 has arrived. Look away! Oh god, is that... Okay, that's better. Okay, alright. This is the most radical departure to the M3 since the E46 because all-wheel drive. And it now makes 500 horsepower plus. And to redeem its slightly hideous front end, they improved the back end immensely with an estate car for the first time as a production model. Hell yes, please. Thank you. We're not getting one because they aren't following Audi's route, but it's okay. We can look from afar. Definitely not jealous at all. This has literally just come out. This year is when the production models start coming. So, we don't know what the performance versions will be, but I can imagine they're going to be incredibly stripped out, incredibly hardcore, and mind-blowingly fast, while continue to define what handling can be described as. What the benchmark for handling is, and that's the M3.